We don't really need a mic, but we do have a mic because we are this is being taped, this conversation, for the future, for our memory and for our archive. We will thank you again. Congratulations, Bouchra, wonderful movie. We are looking forward to hearing more about it with the help of Rike. The conversation, just so that you know, it's in English. It will last about 40 minutes, and then we open up for questions of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you, Bouchra.
Thank you, Rike.
I thought that we start right with the title. The title is 22 Hours, and which refers to a temporality, a duration, whereas many of your other titles rather reference a community, a map, or a constellation. So I was wondering, kind of, from where did you borrow the temporality? And does this temporality in any way reverberate or resonate also the fact that you were a resident, a fellow, that you yourself were on a temporary residency at Harvard during that time of the production of the film?
So we start with this, right?
Yeah, I thought we start with the title because, you know, there is no, as far as I can tell, I saw the film for the first time, but you don't get back to the title immediately in the film.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here on a very sunny Sunday morning. Very much appreciate. And I would like to extend my warmest thanks to Secession, Jeannette Passière and Sylvia for organizing this screening. I'm very thankful and grateful for this invitation, following the exhibition that is still on view for today at the Secession. And I'm very happy that you are here, because you know pretty much well my work, but we never had the opportunity to discuss publicly, so it's great that it's happening here. Well, to answer your question, the title came simply from my reading of Prisoner of Love, the last book of Jean Genet, which original title is Captif amoureux, but very difficult to translate in any other language. And I was actually working on that project for already a few years when the invitation by Harvard was extended to be a fellow for the academic year. But throughout the last years, I was going back regularly to that book and some of the writings of Jean Genet, because most of the time my project develops throughout many years, including the ones that are included in the show at Secession. They started as projects years before they were produced, and somehow they are eventually produced when comes the opportunity to produce them. So for years I was working parallelly on the Tempest Society and on 22 Hours, and reading again and again and again Prisoner of Love. I ended up counting the number of times that Genet is referring to Hamza, and Hamza is a young Palestinian Fada'i who was living in a refugee camp in Jordan, and who somehow inspired him to write Prisoner of Love, along with members of the Black Panther Party. So I literally ended up counting how many times Genet refers to Hamza, and for how many hours he was recounting their meetings. And I ended up counting that it was only 22 hours. And I asked myself a very simple question. Are 22 hours enough to dedicate oneself to the struggle of other people? Is it enough, or just 22 hours to feel committed to the others? So that's why I gave the title to that project. Also because I like those mysterious titles that refer and do not refer to the works, like the Tempest Society. If you don't know the translation of Al-Asifa from the Arabic, the tempest, the storm, you don't know what is this tempest about. So it's somehow organically connected to the work, and at the same time it's never a pure description of it. So that's why I name it the Tempest Society. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
I think you did very well. Thank you. I think you did very well. And I guess it is also because, as I said before, the mapping project, for example, to me that was, kind of something where it already triggers your imagination in a certain way. At least it did in my way. But coming back to Jeunet, because he is, besides Godard, he's one of the central figures in this film. And I was wondering, and you also mentioned maybe we should show this catalog. This is the catalog that I was quoting from. This is the catalog that was published in connection with the exhibition that is still running at the Jeu de Paume. Try to get a copy. It's supposed to be sold out very soon. In this book, there's a text by Bouchra titled Blackboard. I think it's also a good moment to come back to Jean Genet and maybe to hear from you a bit, because you mentioned in this text that you started your research already many years ago. And I know from earlier conversations that Genet has been a companion throughout your career. And you mentioned it already that you've been looking into his essays and texts many times. So when was it, maybe for the first time, that you came across his engagement with the Black Panther Party, and how does this then led also to your research or to your findings, actually, that Godard and Gorin were close by or at the same university around the same time?
Well, I shouldn't say that. But actually, there was nothing new in the story, because I knew it pretty well from a very, very, very long time. So conducting research was not necessarily about finding things I didn't know, but rather locating them more specifically. For different reasons. First, because before becoming an artist, I was a reader of Jean Genet's writing, and somehow also because he belongs, in a way, to my intellectual imagination as someone from North Africa, and who also immigrated to France with my parents. So we knew that he was committed to the movement of decolonization from the French side, but also very much committed to immigrants' rights in France. So I have known Genet's work and engagement for a very long time. And of course, he was in my mind since I started making artworks. Because as I was telling you, he really belongs to that intellectual imagination in a way, along with others like Pier Paolo Pasolini or Chris Marker or Fassbinder, this very specific type of figures who were somehow radically changing art practices, but also a certain conception of the artist as a civic figure, or at least somehow who can embody at a certain moment a civic position within the public sphere. So I was always very much interested in that type of characters, and Jean Genet belongs obviously to that family, again, along many others. As for the let's say the tour of Godard at the moment, when he stopped signing his film, when he refused authorship and engaged with a collective with one single name, Ziga Vertov Group. That was not also something that I didn't know. I knew that he spent time in the US. I also knew that he started a film with an American filmmaker whose name I can't remember now, but maybe I will remember it later. That was called 1 p.m. And that was basically a documentary about radicalism in the US. And there is one pretty long scene of showing an interview of Eldridge Cleaver conducted by Jean-Luc Godard. So there is a lot of material around Godard's stays in the US and his commitment to American intellectuals and American activists. And of course, this came back when he engaged with the Dziga Vertov group or co-founded the Dziga Vertov group. Also because American universities at that time and still today are, but mostly at that time because of the context of the war in Vietnam, were a space where alternative discourses could find somehow a shelter, but also an audience among the students. So when he went to fundraise to the US, he went straight to the university because he also knew that his audience was there among those young American students who were campaigning and advocating against the war in Vietnam. So somehow the connection was obvious between them two. But there are many others, like in the film, Carole Roussopoulos is mentioned. But that very same camera, the porte-à-pack, is also mentioned in Foreign Office. That is at Secession, it's the very same camera. But in Foreign Office, that camera is mentioned because she gave it to Eldridge Cleaver to make a film in Congo. But the very same camera was used to film Jean Genet in Paris. So both works also connect, this history to that object. And that's also the reason why monitors and video material, more than anything else, somehow is so present in the film, because it's also in a way a sort of meditation about video and the very beginning of video and its close connection to activism somehow. Again, to speak about Carole Roussopoulos, she bought that camera the very same week that Jean-Luc Godard bought his camera, the same one, the porte-à-pack, and Chris Marker. So there were like 3 filmmakers in Paris that were buying porte-à-pack cameras and who were using them. So Marker was becoming extremely interested in video making, same for Jean-Luc Godard, and we know that later then he would commit to this Son Image structure that is a sort of workshop, research, studio.
Maybe it's important to mention that you were an intern.
Many years ago, but I don't say it.
So this is why I say it.
I keep it for myself. But,
at Son Image, Jean-Luc Godard.
At Peripheria, the production company that he founded afterwards.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No problem.
So I think there are 2 aspects that interest me. One is obviously video and activism. The other thing was the object, because there's also the moment where you refer to the jacket. Jean Genet's jacket, the leather jacket. And we already talked about it, but it's interesting that when you look at the footage, most of the time he's wearing more or less the same clothes. And suddenly there's this rupture, or I don't know whether that's the correct term to say rupture, but it expresses very directly a change in belonging, or at least stating a different belonging. And then what also kind of struck me was that moment when, correct me if I'm wrong, but when he really actively is using the term we, and not the Black Panther or they or anything, but we. So kind of actively including himself in the campaigning, obviously.
But I think you are referring here to the famous May Day speech. And it was planned that he won't read it that day, that Big Man would read it. So the we is actually the we as said by Big Man, not by Juni anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, which indeed I like very much, because it's. We were speaking before about the end of authorship as Godard tried to define it with Dziga Vertov. Somehow that's what Jean Genet did with the Black Panthers. It was not about his words anymore. He was literally giving those words, and then they could use it the way the Panthers found it the most effective for their cause. So for the May Day speech, it was clear from the day before that Big Man would read it, and that it would be his voice. And that's why in the film it's being said, because that's what witnesses of the May Day said. We didn't know who was talking. Was this written by Big Man, or was this written by Genet, because he was standing next to him, silent, observing. So there was not Or let's say it differently. Jeunet was not anymore the one pushed at the forefront. He was just standing next to them, literally, which somehow also offers a sort of metaphor of solidarity.
And which
standing
makes
next,
him,
not at the forefront, next.
and which makes him this very special witness. So maybe in this context, were there other reasons why you kind of? I remember that also, for example, the work Constellations, a series of silkscreen prints and other works. They start off from a very simple question. Here, in this case, we have the question that also comes up, or repeatedly comes up in the film in various variations: who is the witness? Could you elaborate a bit, like, when was the moment, or why became it so crucial for you to start off with this question here in the context of this material?
I think it also relates to the question of who is allowed to write, let's call it historiography. Who authors historiography? From what does it originate? From what material is it written? How is it collected? And Kiana and Vanessa are somehow historiographers. But the way they are historiographers is through image making, or let's say film editing in a way. Therefore, we can ask if maybe they are the witnesses that I am looking for. But Douglas Miranda, he was a witness in the literal meaning of it, and even more than a witness, because he took care of Jeunet, he organized some of his public lectures. He said much more than what is in the film, but he really traveled with him and organized many, many different gatherings, and most importantly, the May Day and the New Haven, or let's say activism focused on New Haven and Yale, more specifically. So Doug Miranda is, of course, the witness in the literal meaning. He's the guy who met Jeunet, organized the tour, brought him to different places, was sitting next to him, introducing meetings with him. And there are a few pictures in the film showing them sitting together in different places, at MIT, at the University of Connecticut, and so on and so forth. But my bet was that Kiana and Vanessa could become witness. And that's why the film ends with them.
In a particular aesthetic.
In a particular aesthetic, indeed.
Referring to the video activism. So the last image, you can see the lines running.
It's filmed through a video monitor.
Yeah.
And basically
so
the
it's
monitors...
also this jump in time then.
Yeah, that were a bit special to me, because they are the monitors I was using when I learned film editing. So it was like the shift between like the Betacam and the U-matic and the to FCP 101. And these were the monitors I was using.
Yeah.
So it also connects to somehow my private, small history of commitment to video. I worked with those things myself, and somehow Vanessa were just using them. Vanessa and Kiana were just using them the way I used to use them, almost 20 years ago now, when I started learning. So,
which in one way brings us back to the hands and the link to manual labor. But maybe it's also a good moment to quote actually or to refer to the most recent interview that you've done with Hendrik Volkerts recently, published in the recent issue of the Mus magazine that came out this week, where you actually talk about 22 hours. And in one of your answers, you refer to your shooting process. And you describe why it is of particular importance to you to shoot chronologically. Can you help us a bit or share this? I mean, I've read this interview, but could you share this maybe with us? Why it is in particular also in relation to your work with the protagonists, or you call them performers? No, at least in these interviews. All right. Okay, protagonists. We can also say the name, Vanessa and
Kiana. It's a matter of method somehow. Because I shoot for editing, so when I shoot, I know how it will be edited already. So there is no extra material that is being shot for as a sort of backup, just in case something goes wrong in the editing room. But I also shoot that way, because then everyone knows, as much as me, how it will be edited. So the participants in the project who are not performers in the professional meaning of it, they also know what comes before, what comes after, why the shot is being shot now, and what will be shot afterwards. Then they have a clear idea of what we are doing, including technically speaking. And again, it's as much a matter of method, because it's my working method, but also to make sure that they know exactly why it is being shot that way and where it is located exactly within the film editing structure. Because it's important
where we are in the film.
Exactly, because it is important that they know. And same with Doug, because
why
Doug,
is it important?
Why is it important? Because
have you tried otherwise before?
No, because it's not my stuff. To make it the other way.
I should know.
But maybe it's the difference between capturing a picture and making a picture together. Maybe that's where the difference lies. And that's why it's extremely important to me that they know exactly, as much as I do, what we are doing together. Yeah.
Now I'm jumping a bit, but the Tempest Society was co-produced with the Ibsen Award, one of the most prestigious Norwegian awards, the Ibsen Award.
For theater makers.
For theater makers.
And that was a great honor, because I'm not a theater maker, so...
In 2017, you gave a presentation, or you were asked to give a presentation to present the work. Am I correct? And
at the Ibsen Theater.
At the Ibsen Theater. And instead of doing a screening, or screening the Tempest Society...
It was shown.
It was shown? Okay. Yeah. So, sorry, you can see that I wasn't present. I'm just stepping here in the dark, trying to grasp. I wasn't a witness, let's put it like this. But I talked to witnesses, and what they told me is that in addition to the screening, you also did a performance.
I won't dare call it that way. You can, but I won't, because I'm not a performer.
This is what the witnesses are saying.
I don't know what is a performance, or I don't know how to do it. But they understood it as a performance. I was expected to perform, and I'm not a performer, so I did something that can be understood as a performance, but I won't call it that way because I'm not a performer.
So what did you do?
Basically, I gave a sort of lecture, and the three main protagonists of the Tempest Society were sitting in the audience, and at the end of it, they were asking me questions about our collaboration, which I found very interesting to have it publicly happening. And I included in it an excerpt of a film by Pasolini, which I like a lot, Appunti per un'Orestiade africana, that includes 2 scenes where he shows excerpts of his Orestiade and then engage with a debate with African students from different African countries about his own perception of mostly Tanzania, and Kenya, where the film was shot. And it becomes a conversation between them, because he asked them, my hypothesis, or I started from the idea that if the Orestiade should be implemented today, it should be in newly independent African countries, because the Orestiade is basically about the birth of democracy. And they were like, no, this is wrong, like this is your own fantasy. And I found it very interesting that he included it in the film. So during that performance, I showed an excerpt of this. And I put myself on trial, literally. So that's why I think it was understood as a performance.
Intervention whatsoever. Okay.
Because most of the time when a conversation around an artwork is being organized, the ones who participated are rarely present or have the possibility to talk or to speak from their own perspective about that kind of project. So for me, it was important that they were there, because we spent a lot of time together. And of course, they have also other perspectives on the work. So I felt it was important that their perspectives would be included. So it became not a conversation with an audience, even though it happened after, but with them first, because it had to happen.
Which brings us back to the role of archives and what finds its way into the archive, actually. But I also would like to come back here to this front cover of the catalog and the title. Ich soll es mal zeigen. Blackboard. Blackboard. There aren't too many blackboards in 22 hours, but there's also a blackboard in the Tempest Society, and there are blackboards at campus, of course, at universities. In your text, you refer to a very particular scene or a conversation also between Gorin and Godard, where they talk about, or where they try to define the political image. Would you share this with us and the role of the blackboard and how to subvert or twist this particular, the meaning and the function that is usually attributed to the blackboard as a way where knowledge is organized?
Well, first of all, there are many, let's say, surfaces in my works on which things are written or being moved or being put together. So just as an example, in 22 hours, I would say that there are many blackboards, but those blackboards just look like TV monitors. It's basically the same thing. Or you were referring before to the Mapping Journey project. It's also about a surface that is being subverted.
Extremely.
Or in Foreign Office, or literally in the Tempest Society, where a blackboard is physically present and being used, and on which constellations are being drawn and literally bringing things together, but not as premises, but rather as a sort of conclusion. More than anything else. Well, that quote about the blackboard is actually very, very famous, because the Dziga Vertov group referred to it at many different occasions, because they were working on it, and they were working with it. They were just trying to figure out what they were doing, how one could define the practices with which they were engaged. And they decided to call it a blackboard. And if they called it a blackboard, it's also because what was at stake with them is how can we define a pedagogy of the image? What could be a pedagogy of the image? But the debate was a very important debate at that time anyway, because if one goes back to the essays by Serge Danet as an example, when he speaks about pedagogy of the image, he always speaks about the Godard, Dziga Vertov, but also about Straubuet.
And you see the blackboard in Farocki. In all of his early films.
Absolutely. So it was a very important question, this question of pedagogy of the image. But what it means is not that a film has to be turned into a lecture, but rather that the means with which cinematic images are produced should be transparent and included in the film itself and interrogated as such within the structure of the film, or let's say the cinematic work that is produced. And that's why there are also many machines, as an example, being shown in Dziga Vertov's group's films, or in the film made afterwards by Godard with Anne-Marie Miéville. Machines are there because the images come also from there.
And the frame.
And the frame, but also from that specific type of technology. So when I was simply thinking of a title for the show at Jeu de Paume, Blackboard came spontaneously. It's also a way to pay my duty to a certain history of filmmaking.
Sure. Yeah. Are there questions? Oh.
At the same time, your exhibition was shown here. There was a small retrospective at Film Museum about the works of Sarah Maldoror. And obviously there are a lot of references to same things, same people, Negritude movement and Algiers in the early 60s and so on. And thinking that over, I asked myself, there must have been female intellectuals at that time, a lot more than only Maldoror. Why are your the historical protagonists always men? Or I don't know all of your work, but as far as I know.
Well, here there are two women, young, in their early 20s. In Foreign Office, it's...
Yes, but I meant the historical figures.
Ah.
Like Godard, Gorin,
No, I mean, Duras is amazingly important for me. I don't make it, I don't see it, and many are queer, like Fassbinder, Genet, Pasolini, so I don't think that seeing it from a gender perspective is the right approach, to be honest. Because, of course, it's much more complex than that. And when I refer to Godard, I refer to his collaboration with Anne-Marie Miéville mostly, because she was also very close to the group already. So
maybe what I could add is that we briefly also spoke about the fact that, often very few voices only find entry into the archive. So here now in our conversation, we have mainly referred to I'm done. I get signs here. To Godard, to Gorin, to Genet. But I also remember from other conversations, and also you mentioned it just now, like the importance to... Sorry, now I got really lost. Okay, Sabit, please.
Probably Bouchra would like to answer this first.
That was not really a finished question from my side, I must say. It was more...
So what was the question?
I got lost.
So I tried.
No, but it's interesting that you are mentioning Sarah Maldoror, because it's true that her work should be shown more. Unfortunately, I had the opportunity to see only one film by her. And that was actually after I made Foreign Office, because someone mentioned Sarah Maldoror to me. And I found it extremely interesting, because she's French-Caribbean, she's a woman, she was an activist, and she was also a filmmaker. But what people mostly remember about her was that she was engaged to Mario Pinto de Andrade. And not that she was an intellectual, a filmmaker. I absolutely agree. That's true. And connecting this to the archives, and I'm not answering anymore your question here, but just as a matter of clarifying the relationship to the archive, I don't consider it as archive, personally. I rather see it as a sort of family album in which I take things and I put them together, and more than anything else. And I'm usually somehow a bit, let's say, I won't say skeptical, it's not the right word. Yeah, I'm not very much into the fetishization of the archives. It's visual material. And it's things, I mean, the way it is shown in the films, it's actually the way I use them myself when I work.
And they remain fragments.
Yeah. And they don't come out from super clean boxes. You don't need to wear gloves, and because it belongs to everyone, too.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great to see the film and also to see it in relation to the films in your exhibitions. And what becomes so significant is the performance or the way how the protagonists, as Rike called them, are performing. There's always a kind of static moment. There's always something in between monologue and dialogue, something between speaking just the text as it was an instruction, or to put them as a kind of interaction. So there's always a kind of in-between and a very static moment in a certain sense. It's not the vivid, very animated performance. Yeah. My question was regarding what you said about the way how you produce your films, that you always know exactly what to shoot and when to shoot. What does this kind of performance mean to your way of deciding about the montage of the film beforehand? Is that already thought as a kind of montage of speech acts and performance, of portrait, of image and language? So it's a very general question.
First of all, I'm not sure if in my works in video, it's really about performance. I'm not sure. It's mostly about speech acts. That is true, and that's why I don't feel the need at all to engage in collaboration with professional performers or professional actors. I prefer meeting people with no preconceived idea. Kiana and Vanessa actually come from the very same area from where Douglas Miranda come from, because the situation hasn't changed that much for African American in Boston since the 70s, at least geographically speaking. We are still talking about the same areas: Roxbury, Dorchester, South Boston. So I just spent time there, and I got to know them, and they were fantastic. I mean, first because they didn't know about Jean Genet's visit to the U.S., and they didn't know about Douglas Miranda himself, while he was one of the captain of the Boston chapter, and then became a more prominent figure within the party structure. So for them, it was also about their own history with which they were reconnecting through that project. And that somehow became a sort of basis for our relationship, more than directing or whatever, because I'm not a director. I don't direct in the proper sense of it. It's more the result of our conversations. Of course, it looks very direct and clear, but it's just about our relationship and nothing more than that. Very simple, It's the same thing as with other works.
For an office in particular.
Yeah, for any office that I mean, there's no performance in my works. It's always about engaging in a relationship that lasts often for months. Like for Tempest Society, we had a sort of workshop, but the workshop was more about sharing with them all the material, because I wanted to share all the details of El Asifa's story and so on and so forth. It was not about it was not a performer workshop. It was about the project itself.
But to which extent are these texts scripted?
Speaking of 22 hours, you mean? Or Tempest
For example,
Society? Let's take... Well, it's scripted in a very organic way, and somehow it refers to an idea I have been reflecting on literally for years, what Pasolini defined as cinema of poetry, like who speaks when someone speaks. Is it that person, or are there others who are present? And is it possible to turn the subjective into the collective? And the reason why the performance is so minimal, it's also because somehow it allows a sort of multitude, in a way, to be brought together suddenly, virtually. So they speak for themselves, but they also speak for others. And of course, they speak for me. And speaking of the script, it's very organic, because of course there are things that I have written there, but there are also quotes, and there are also things that Kiana and Vanessa said. And it's even more clear when it comes to Doug Miranda, because it's his statement somehow as a witness. And he's not sharing a sort of raw testimony. He reflected on it for many weeks, what he wanted to say about his commitment, his meeting with Juni, how he engaged with the party, and so on and so forth.
Quite a jump now. Thank you very much for your film. I'm a historian interested in images and in media history, and I liked very much the tension of different time aspects. You are, in a way, connecting all the time. And therefore, I want to ask you if you could explain a little bit more your decision to take the mobile phone as a reference frame for the biography photographs of Juni, because I want to connect this interest with the question to video activism, which is so in the center of your interest, your practice, and in which way it does relate that you decide in the beginning of the film to take this frame with is there a relation? Is it only my fantasy? I would like to hear some words about it.
Things always start with very simple facts. When I arrived in the US, I had to take a phone. And I never had a smartphone. And now I'm back in Europe and I throw out the smartphone. So for the first time in my life, I had a smartphone with a pretty good camera, 4G, and all those stuff that I never used, that I didn't want to use. For different reasons. I never take pictures myself with cell phones. I just never do it. Because making an image is still something important to me. So most of the time I don't make pictures unless I'm working on something specific. But there I had to pick up a phone like that because they were the only ones available. So I take the cheapest. And I started observing how people use them around me. And I started also observing how Kiana and Vanessa were showing things to each other. So it came naturally from what I was observing. I know it sounds ridiculous, but to me that was new because I never had a smartphone. And then I was very interested in the sliding because it's a sort of self-editing that you do. And most of the time in your smartphone, you also have a sort of family album in a way. Because then you can show the nephew. And I was also receiving pictures from my siblings because I had a nephew who was born while I was in the US. And that's how I was receiving things, like a picture of him and and this was forming a sort of somehow folder for a potential editing. So I started just connecting this with editing practice and a sort of timeline of image making that somehow starts with this and goes back to how editing used to be conceived in a way. But if you think of Foreign Office, it operates the same way because the photos that you see first hanged on the wall actually refer to how editing used to be made before the digital age. You would hang like photograms and figure out the editing of the film from those pictures that are hanged. So now it can look like a sort of installation. It was just a matter of method and nothing more than that. So what I had in mind is that those pictures could end up on a black table and that black table could become an editing suite. The same way that the smartphone is potentially an editing suite too, depending on what images you are showing and how you put them together, how you relate them together, how you create a sense of connection between them. So it's just about montage, what montage is about as a very basic level. Putting things together and looking how they interact or react to each other and what kind of discourse they generate as well.
And the connection with video activism in the sense of the history, the media history of using techniques, of using this kind of machines is not there. I wasn't sure about it. You didn't connect this idea in video in media history, this idea of activism in the 70s with possible activities with the smartphones now and their importance in any kind of revolutionary practices.
But it was not my purpose. I was not conducting
because
a study
it is there, of course, in
in
our heads if we
Absolutely.
see this. And there's a lot of other things there, of course. And I just wanted to know if this is a decision or an intention of you.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure about it,
First,
and
because
I doubt if it works, if it was your idea. I'm interested in it. I'm not sure.
It was not my purpose.
But it was interesting to hear. It is the editing idea, which is interesting.
Yeah, and
Thank
that's
you
why
for that.
the monitors are so
There's a
present
question
as
in the
forms
back
of
first. Monika, das ist hinten noch vorher eine. Entschuldigung.
Hi. I would like to ask you how and why did you decide for this very specific aspect ratio for the video?
It's the screen ratio of all of my works in video for the last 15 years. I started with that and I kept committed to that screen ratio. And as a photographer, I also work with medium format because I started making photos with film negatives and always 6x7, so I just stick to that.
Hi, I have another aesthetic question, and it's about framing. And also, I wanted to say that I was very happy to see Carol Roussopoulos, I want to see much more of her. And and my question is about framing. It's actually two, and I think one is how you frame the protagonist and the people you were working together. In a kind of, you described it as a working together that went very organically, but I wonder about the choices of having a witness kind of reading their own testimony in this kind of very, I don't know how to call it, in this with this estrangement effect of talking maybe about their own experiences, but it's so distanced, yes. So I wanted to know about this choice and also about the choice of lighting, of this person people being in the shadows, and then, but also then in another moment, kind of framed like in a talk show, like very visible on other levels, and also. Sorry, that's the last one. And also framing a film about witnessing, and Jean Genet, who I find super interesting and very relevant also today, framing it through 3 black bodies, and not like, why not other people who are allies like him, or other people who aspire to be a witness in a different way. So yeah, thank you.
I will answer first your last question.
I was sitting somewhere else, I never got the mic.
It's also about my own connection to Genet. I'm not French. I became later a French citizen, but I was not born a French citizen. I was born in North Africa, in Morocco, in Casablanca, in a very specific place that Genet visited very often, and to which he was very committed. And when I was telling Rike that he belonged to my intellectual imagination, I could say also geographically speaking, he belonged to my intellectual imagination, because he committed himself to Morocco, Algeria, because one of his first engagement was against French colonization, and standing in solidarity with the ones who were fighting against it. So the same way that I consider that Jean Genet belongs to my history somehow, I also believe that African Americans not only inherited the history of, let's say, civic struggle movements, like the Black Panthers, but also the history of their allies, or the history of those who decided to stand in solidarity the way it was the most effective for the party, as we are talking about the BPP, because they defined Jean Genet's solidarity, and he accepted it. So therefore, one can consider that now he also belongs to the history of the African American struggle for liberation, let's say, or I should rather say equality. Real equality, not formal equality. But again, it also relates to my own connection with him, because he was an ally of colonized people, meaning my parents who were born colonized, and also North African migrants and workers in France. He stood in solidarity with them too. So that's why it was, for me, important to reconnect this. Because literally it's also about a sort of intergenerational conversation that is happening. And I don't need to make things like very explicit, amazingly clear, because it just happened. And there are many ways to make it happen. And it's also about subverting somehow existing formats. You were referring to the TV show. I agree. But this was on purpose. Because ironically, it can happen like that. You know, one can imagine a sort of TV show. Okay, today we have a former member of the BPP and 2 young women living in Southern, and let's have them meeting. It could happen, you know. Crazy things happen on TV, so this could happen too. So,
in particular, local TV.
Yeah, but the fact is that it didn't happen. So how do you make it happen? Nevertheless, being very much conscious of how images are now perceived, and what is called today an image, and somehow subverting it. So what is often expected now is that when a witness speaks as such, he should speak as a witness, or how she or he is expected to speak as a witness, precisely to not putting things into very specific context, but also to add to it a sort of emphasize on I don't know, making it look like very human and provoking empathy or whatever. But what about if you do it differently? It's exactly the opposite. And I'm not saying anything special here. I'm just referring to the basic distancing effect as it is understood in performance precisely, which I personally find very interesting, because it's also a way to say that what you are looking at is an image. And the people you are watching do not pretend to be to embody something realistically speaking, but rather to participate in your own reflection on what you are seeing. It's just a matter of transparency. So it's not about like creating a sense of identification or so on and so forth. It's basically about keeping saying what you are watching is an image. Nevertheless, those people are speaking for themselves, and they are also speaking for others who are not there. And maybe you, as viewers, are also very much included in that conversation. Maybe it's also about you.
Last question.
There was just this one thing that was really, I have to say, it was bothering me because there were material where I could see René, and he's, he's somehow performing himself. And then I have 3 black bodies being so mediated, so directed, so constrained into, and even like you switch a light on, you switch a light off. It's very manipulated, and that somehow, like that black bodies are not telling their own, that they're not having the agency to express themselves, but that they are following a script is something that's very much part of the history of anti-blackness. And so I thought, this difference between a René that is visible as someone that is also performing, and then 3 black bodies performing under this one regimen is something that I found very bothersome, I have to say. And I wondered what would happen if it was 3 white bodies. Why does it have to be 3 black people performing this?
It's actually something that we discussed extensively with Vanessa, Kiana, and Doug, precisely avoiding what is conceived today as the performance of blackness, or what is expected from black bodies to perform, or how they should look like. And we actually agreed that they should be very quiet, very precise, and this is a collective decision, that they would precisely not looking like they are performing, because immediately it can be quickly connected to, again, pre-existing images of how black people should speak like. When Juni was performing, he was doing it on purpose, because Carol Rossopoulos' films is actually made of 2 takes. One is this one, on which he looks angry, and the other one is the complete opposite. And they decided to use the first one. So I'm not sure if the comparison with Jean Genet really makes sense within that context, because Doug says exactly the same thing at some point. He says that he was performing anger in Yale when he was trying to expand the solidarity on campus, and he said it. I had to say things extreme. So of course he was performing the painter as the way he's perceived, dangerous, and so on and so forth. But the question is rather, because what you call agency here can be also easily confused of what is expected from black people to react, look like, speak like. What about if you do exactly the opposite of what is usually expected? What about if, for once, they can be shown talking in a very quiet way, very precise, and agency here is also how they masterize their own history, and how they masterize the material of their own history, and how they masterize the discourse on that material, on that history. So I think it's really a matter of perception, and also, or I should say, a matter of perspective on what is blackness today, more than anything else, I guess.
Thank you, Bouchra.
You're welcome.
Thank you to the audience. I think the cinema will eventually want to clear up and start their normal program. So you were very, very generous.
You're welcome.
And you asked very great questions, the audience and Rike, and I thank you very much for it.